Fangen wir einfach allmählich an. Herzlich willkommen zurück. Welcome back here. This number is Disconnected, Strategies for De-Networking. This is the title of this panel within a section called The Politics of Sleep. Welcome back. Welcome to you all back. Don't fall asleep, stay awake. Obviously, we are now drifting into more metaphorical areas, but this is not to say that we wouldn't deal with very concrete questions and very crucial questions too, I think. Being online, being in a social network, being observed, all these are potentially 24/7 activities. And what we need now are strategies for de-networking. At least this is the assumption to start with. The godfather of this assumption might be Bartleby. Bartleby, the character in Melville, at least since the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze quoted Bartleby's formula, namely, I would prefer not to. But is this really a gesture of emancipation? Let me introduce to you Eleanor Saitta and Urs Stäheli. Urs Stäheli is going to speak to us first. After that, Eleanor Saitta will respond. Urs Stäheli is a professor in sociology, teaches in Hamburg, Germany, and one of his central references in his work is Niklas Luhmann. And one of his systematic focuses is evidently media sociology, cultural sociology. But there is also a direct link connecting his work with the topic of this panel, because Urs Stäheli recently published an essay called Ent-Netzt euch. So de-network yourself, or even de-network each other, I don't know. And an essay with the title Die Angst vor der Gemeinschaft, Figuren des Schüchternen, the Fear of Community, Figures of Shyness. So I'm curious what his talk now is about exactly. No connection, undoing network.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction, and thank you very much being able to speak here at this conference about de-networking, which is actually a quite difficult English notion. In German it's, as you said, Ent-Netzung, and I always struggle to find a good English notion. Now here it is undoing networks, but undoing networks is also not totally correct, because what I'm interested in is how can we actually cut links in networks, in social networks. And I'm not only speaking about social media, but I'm speaking from the perspective of a social theorist who is interested in different spheres of society, looking at these spheres in terms of network. So I want to address two questions in this talk. The first question is I want to somehow legitimize my call for thinking about de-networking. So the first question is, why is it crucial actually to think about undoing networks? And one of the answers will be that what has been described as network society is characterized by hyperconnectivity, by too much connections, by too many connections between nodes, and that this increasingly produces problems in our society. And the second part of the talk will address more closely the question of how could we actually think about something like de-networking if we do not only want to think about it in negative terms. Let me start with the negative terms. Very often in our everyday digital life, we encounter messages like this, failure messages, when we try to connect to a network, and somehow the connection doesn't work. These failure messages have an underlying moment that they actually promise us normally everything would work. Normally connections would be possible. Normally there wouldn't be a problem. And what we also see in these messages is that what you could call the kind of motto of the network society, please try again. If it doesn't work now, it will work later on if you do a second attempt of connecting. These failure messages are only able to capture the moment of disconnection as a technical failure, as an accident. And what I want to point at in this talk is that we actually need a more positive language about that what normally is only seen as a failure of connection. What kind of language, what kind of vocabulary can we find in order to produce more positively, if you like, about disconnection, to speak more positively about desired disconnections? Just an example for how the imperative, how the command to connect is characterizing our society today is this quite old Nokia ad, connecting people. And I think this shows quite well what normally is expected of within network societies, within different spheres of network societies, that you should be able to connect. And very roughly speaking, when we look at the sociological language of networks and also the everyday language of networks, we can distinguish between two levels of the use of network. One of them is to have a descriptive language and to produce maps of network. And the other one, closely linked to the first one, is a normative dimension of the very speaking about networks. And the normative dimension was already indicated with the try again. So it does not only describe networks, but as a subject moving within networks, you are obliged to produce new connections. This has been very clearly and very nicely shown in Boltanski and Capello's book on the new spirit of capitalism, where the networking person is the open person who is interested to producing more and more contacts, who never puts himself or herself in a corner, but who wants to produce new connections. And this attitude is characterizing more and more fields of our society. I can't speak about all the fields which you see here on the map. I only put them on the slide in order to illustrate that it is actually not only a problem for social media, but rather many different spheres of society are confronted with this call for producing more and more connection. Let me only look very briefly at organizations, at companies, where, for example, the introduction of the open office idea, an office without walls. The open office idea was a very good example of enabling networking in the everyday of an organization. And we see now many studies show at the problems of the open office concepts. People get exhausted. People are actually much less productive than was expected. They very often become rather more streamlined and more controlled, observed than creative, what was originally planned. So already with the open office model, we see that the very idea, which was originally quite a good idea because it was directed against hierarchically organized organizations, that this idea produces its own problems. And this is what I call the problems caused by too much connectivity. And we can distinguish very different sides of these problems. On the sides of the subjects moving within the networks, we encounter problems of exhaustion. The philosopher Byung-Chul Han has written a nice book with the title Müdigkeitsgesellschaft, Fatigue Society, so that this sort of fatigue produced by the imperative of producing new connection becomes more and more typical for different spheres of our society. And we also have the marginalization of those who are actually not willing or seen as unable to network, and that is also, you mentioned my paper on the shy person or the introvert person, that comes very clearly, that is very clearly phrased in contemporary discussions about the shy person. And what is quite interesting is that actually at the moment we have a kind of re-signification of what being an introvert means, that suddenly you have business books saying the quiet person, like Susan Cain's bestseller, the quiet person is actually the creative person because she or he does not network so much and has the capacity to go back to severe links, at least for a certain time. When we look at social media, and I'm still now looking for what could be a vocabulary for grasping this moment of not networking, of delinking, we find a kind of very ugly vocabulary. We find delinking, unfollowing, defriending, untrusting. And what you see with this vocabulary is how normal it has become that we think in linkages, in connections, and that we only can think of de-networking in negative terms. One of the sociologists, actually, who was pointing at the moment of delinking as something which is not only a failure, but a positive moment in the social fabric, was actually Gabriel Tarde, a French philosopher who wrote a very interesting book around 1900 in his, which is called The Sociology of Imitation. And that book has now become one of the classics in network theory. But Gabriel Tarde was actually quite skeptical about having more and more connections. And I just read you this small quote. He wrote at in the conclusion of the book, "But it is perfectly possible that civilization may pause someday to draw back and give birth to a new offspring, that the flood of imitation, you could say, of connecting, may be banked in, and that through the very effect of its excessive development, the need of sociability may diminish, or rather may become altered and transformed into some sort of general misanthropy, eine generelle Menschenfeindlichkeit." And it is about this general misanthropy which he does not see as a failure of society, but actually as an opportunity for thinking and for producing non-links. And what stands in, or what arises in that moment for him is that what he calls the finest flower of social life, the aesthetic life, would blossom forth. And this points an interesting this is quite interesting also in contemporary discussion about the role of art and avant-garde art for network capitalism. The classical argument is always to say that avant-garde art actually prepared network capitalism. This is the argument by Boltanski and Ciappello. And I think we could actually develop an alternative perspective on avant-garde art as a sort of heuristics which helps us to think about what de-networking, of what not networking would mean. I only want to mention one quite famous example by the American artist Lee Lozano, who did a very remarkable piece of art in 1969, which was called the General Strike piece. This General Strike piece was the organization of her leaving the system of art. So she wanted to stop being an artist, and she made this desire of not being any longer an artist into an art performance, into a piece of art. And what from my perspective of how can we think de-networking is interesting is when we look at how did she actually organize this process of leaving the system of art. she did practice it very well. It was not a moment action, but it was actually a leaving of the art system which took several years. And you can read here some of her instructions, how you can practice to leave the art system. So, for example, she says gradually don't go to gallery openings. Gradually do no longer meet your fellow artists. Gradually avoid being with certain artists in the same gallery room. And she practiced this during several years. And what we can see here in this piece, the general strike piece, is that it is actually quite complicated of becoming invisible in the system of art. And we also can see that in a sense she was not absolutely successful, because she is now very famous, or still is a very famous artist, one of the most important Swiss galleries, Hauser and Wirth, is now hosting her material. But nevertheless, I think we can learn a lot from what Lee Lozano was doing from our perspective of de-networking. I also should actually mention that she took that performance very seriously. After the last part, the dropout piece, she never produced a piece of art any longer. So for 30 years, she really had left the system of art. So what can we learn from this perspective is, first of all, that what I mentioned before, that de-networking requires planning. It is not a spontaneous action, but rather you have to develop a script. You have to learn of how to loosen links, of how to de-network. Secondly, we can see that it is a process during possibly even during years or during months, but it is not, again, a once-only event. Thirdly, we can also see that de-networking offers a sort of aesthetic fascination for artists, and that it could be an interesting perspective to look also at other artists of how they exploit the aesthetic fascination of cutting links. Fourthly, and I think this points also at the potentially political dimension of de-networking, in Lee Lozano's case, at least the beginning of the process of leaving the art system was a public event. The manifesto was published in an art magazine, whereas the last piece was only written down in her notebook. Making the de-networking partially public also produces a kind of political irritation, a political provocation for the social sphere you are moving within. And eventually, I already hinted at that point, it's of course a failing utopia, and I think it would also be a highly problematic utopia if we understood networking as a utopia of an island which would no longer be connected with anything else, and that this would even hold for an eternity. What I'm rather interested in is, how is it possible to move within networks and produce islands of disconnectivity, islands of not linking up within networks? So it's not a radical against networks position, but rather a sort of modulation, thinking about what would it mean, how would we have to transform networks, and what would be the practices for making possible these practices. And I only want very briefly point at three dimensions of how to disconnect, of how to sever links. And you mentioned Luhmann in the paper. I'm very loosely drawing from Luhmann's dimensions of meaning in order to organize this argument. One important aspect of not linking up is the time dimension, the temporal dimension. And crucial elements of this would be what has been called Entschleunigung, slowing down, producing temporary islands of non-connectivity. also of producing delays, of waiting, of Stillstand, moments where there is no time or the time has gone which would allow to link up. Spatially, it is quite interesting that many network models think of the open office, which I mentioned in the beginning of my talk, that many network representations assume a kind of transparent space where you can see how the different nodes link up to each other. The art of not linking up, the art of disconnection would require intransparent spaces, would require spaces for hiding, spaces where withdrawal is possible. And again, returning to the open office model, it is interesting or telling that the contemporary discussion of office architecture actually tries to reintroduce hiding spaces, is formulating a critique of the transparent space. And I think this is also kind of important political message that transparency is not automatically democratic. Transparency does not automatically produce subversive effects. And thirdly, the social dimension. What is important if you don't want to link up in a network is to become invisible, to lose your address so that you are no longer, that other members of the network or the network is no longer able to address you. And we have here in the discussion, in the theoretical discussion, and also in, by different social activist groups, very good concepts like the becoming imperceptible, a concept which is being discussed within migration sociology, where it is about of not becoming visible as a singular, as a named person, but rather to disappear in the network. We have practices like anonymous, where the node becomes depersonalized, or we have practices like those of Luther Blissett, where you have multiple usernames, which also tries to somehow subvert that what it means to have an address in a network. And let me come to the last slide of my presentation. A Greek colleague of mine recently pointed me to this new Greek journal, which was only funded a couple of months ago, and which is called Unfollow. And I think this is quite telling for the political perspective, which goes along with an interest in de-networking. Unfollow, I think, also points at that if we want to exploit the political dimensions of de-networking, of not linking up, then we have to move beyond the politics of representation. We have to move beyond the politics of recognition and rather look at these practices which often do not find a big discourse, a big representation, but rather at these situational tactics which are being used for cutting links. In that sense, this unfollowing is also a critique of many very well-established forms of non-hegemonic politics, and I think where the perspective of cutting links, of de-networking, would also allow us to talk about, to think about other theoretical models than those informed by identity politics. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Urs Stäheli. I'm not sure if this vision is a darker one or a brighter one, but we can discuss that later, perhaps. Eleanor Saitta describes herself as a hacker, designer, an artist, a writer, and barbarian. I like this self-description very much because it's obvious that it's not complete, this series of jobs. She is also, among other things, the principal security engineer at the Open Internet Tools Project, Open ITP, and I'm very curious what you have to add or to speak to us. Thank you.
So I make a practice out of studying how systems fail, because I think in some ways the failures of systems have a lot more to tell us about how they actually work than their normal functioning. Their normal functioning tells us something about how they were intended to work. And so I think what you're seeing, the phenomenon of de-networking, the phenomenon here is that we're looking at as a response to a set of failures. It's a response to ways in which the network is failing people. And I think that it's an interesting response, but not necessarily the most useful response. Networks can be liberatory or progressive. They can serve to centralize control. They can serve to, make previously illegible social groups radically transparent to authority, or vice versa. They can make, previously opaque authority radically transparent to populations. I think that we have a responsibility as users of systems to take up the mantle of designing those systems, whether or not we have any agency in the moment in that negotiation, but to actively take up that mantle and say, well, screw what this system looks like. What do we want this system to look like? What do we want this set of interactions to look like? And from that perspective, I think de-networking can be a part of that. I am going to redesign my interactions with this system, but if you structure that from a perspective of redesign, you end up in a very different position. You end up saying that, well, maybe the issue is that Facebook is not a network I want to participate in because Facebook is designed to make me spend time with Facebook, not to accomplish tasks. Maybe I'm going to move over to some other more task-focused network, or maybe I'm going to go install a bunch of plugins that people have designed to change what content is presented on Facebook so that I now see a different view of the network that is more productive or is more, I hesitate to use a neoliberal word like productive in this context, is more satisficing to my goals, whatever those goals are. One of the things that we're still learning about networks is what those failures actually look like. Latour said that the creation of the train, the invention of the train, was the invention of the train wreck. The invention of the network is the invention of the network wreck. We don't know what a network wreck is yet. We don't know what it looks like. We don't know under what conditions it happens. We don't know that, oh, you're going too fast around this curve. You might run into an utter loss of ability to perform social empathy. I have no idea what's around that curve or what the curve is. But I think we're starting to understand some of these failures, and some of these are that we get systems that are built to centralize authority. We get systems that are built to make us legible to power when we might not want to be legible to those powers, whether that is, an advertiser or a national security organization. There's this constant thread among mostly people who didn't grow up using networks that, oh, networks are making us stupid. They don't allow us to think. They don't give us enough time. I think that there are some real considerations about the pace and the set of interactions that we have designed into systems. But I think that's also partially just because there's a lot of different ways that negotiation for what our social life looks out, ends up looking like. One of the really fascinating just historical anecdotes a few years back was the 200th anniversary of the Luddite rebellions in the UK. And it turns out that the Luddites were actually a very sensible group of people who were rebelling strongly, not against, they weren't anti-technology. They were against the specific forms of breakdown of their existing ways of living and ways of being society, that the shift from home weaving to factory weaving was creating. It wasn't about the fact that they were suddenly using power looms. It was the fact that the power looms were in a factory where their working hours were set by someone else. They didn't want a return to an older style of production. They wanted to retain a human-centric form of living. And I think that that is exactly the kind of rebellion, exactly the kind of renegotiation of our interactions with technical systems, which is really interesting now. Networks have logic. All of these systems that we interact with are designed to do certain things. One of the problems right now is the way that these networks are designed. I've been around Silicon Valley, I've been around the tech industry for a very long time. No one really has time to think. And this is possibly part and parcel of the world that's being created there, but this is a problem that doesn't come from programming, it comes from capitalism. It comes from you are beholden to your next quarterly result, et cetera. And if you're trying to design a system for social interaction in a context where you are beholden to every quarter's sales figures or advertising returns or whatever, of course you're not going to spend a lot of time thinking about the deep time consequences of the system that you're shipping, because honestly, is the system even going to be around in 5 years? Whatever. Why are you thinking these questions? This is, and if you're in that room with that design meeting, these questions don't come up. And I think that we are in a very dangerous position right now where all of the design decisions about social structures are being made in explicitly commercial contexts where the people making them, for instance, have every reason to both think in short terms, think in ways of manipulating us that are not necessarily in our best interests, and also to collude with state power, to do lots of other things that have a variety of negative consequences. Slow design as kind of a structure, as a mindset, is really problematic in a lot of things. It privileges a kind of time that very few people have. But I think that one can say that, we should perhaps design for longer periods of time. If you imagine as you go to build a system, or if you imagine as you go to negotiate your use of a system, let's think about, I'm going to be using this system for 50 years. You end up having a very different conversation there. And a lot of the points I'm making from here are me speaking as a tool builder, because I think that in some ways, one of the problems of the digital revolution is that a lot of the people who are making the decisions about how these systems are structured are the programmers, and if you're not in that room, your opinion doesn't really count. To me, this is an argument for a more diverse technical culture and to a much broader range of interactions there, because I think we are kind of stuck with that at some level. One of the fascinating things, and again, returning to this thread on the failure of systems, one of the fascinating things to think about or a fascinating and productive way of thinking about systems, is that every system encodes a certain set of behavior which it's intended to produce, intended to perform. In response to some set of input, it generates some set of outputs. But if you give it some other random output, it may do some other kind of computation than what was intending. So many technical systems embed these kind of weird machines, to use my friend Meredith Patterson's phrase, that they embed we call these bugs, right? This is a bug. You put in some input, you get some weird output that you weren't expecting. But actually, that is that this machine that you thought was an accounting system is also a general purpose computer, and I'm now using it to do some other thing that you weren't planning on. I think that a lot of the social structures we have are also weird machines. And we can design failure modes. We can design the kinds of weird machines that we build to some limited degree. We can think about what kinds of failures we want out of our systems. One final point, somewhat unrelated to that. There's a notion that I came across fairly recently called a topocracy. So you're probably familiar with a meritocracy. A meritocracy is the imaginary concept where you have a room and everyone in the room is rewarded equally to the work that they put in a purely fair structure. Of course, this is bullshit because certain kinds of work are more visible. Affective labor is generally invisible in most social settings. Certain people are never in the room because they were never given the opportunity to acquire the skills to be in the room. I mean, there's lots of one would hope at this point, reasonably well understood problems there. And if you pretend that you have a meritocracy, you can't correct for that set of problems structurally. A topocracy is the same concept, but about the structure of a network. If you have a position where you have a sparse network and you have a position where you're the middleman and you get to proxy all of the exchanges between two distinct parts of the network, that's a specific position of power. And there's another set of issues which are just as pernicious as a meritocracy that happen in that context. And I think that this is another related issue to how we decide to specifically choose to shape which connections we do make and which connections we do not make. In the same way that there, in most systems which might otherwise be a supposed meritocracy, one needs a rebalancing function to provide some kind of equality that undoes the otherwise existing social inequalities. We may find that in networks we require rebalancing mechanisms to undo the effects of topocracy.
Thanks a lot. I think I'm going to ask 2 or 3 questions, and after that I would like to invite you to ask questions as well. Despite the differences between your perspective, I think that the both of you have one thing in common. You think about dealing with technology and networks as they exist. Whereas Evgeny Mozorov a few hours ago stated that he just wanted to change the whole conversation and not talk about technology, but about politics or economy. Perhaps my first question to you, is it possible to think about technology without being political?
No. I mean, every discussion about a technological artifice is a discussion about the entire social structure that artifice, that object is embedded in. I think that it is, one can pretend that one is only having a purely technical discussion with no political or economic or environmental side effects, but you're going to miss most of the actual conversation there. And I think that it is critical to recognize that when you have a supposedly purely political discussion, you are also having a technical or a social and economic and environmental conversation. But the two are the same thing.
Okay, and could you give a concrete example for that?
So, for instance, if you talk about the technical structure of, let me think, the technical structure of an online shopping system, right? Do we need to, we have this form and we're going to fill in the form and we're going to ask for a first name and a last name, right? So now you have put a social requirement on everyone who interacts with the shopping system, that they have a coherent and fixed object that is a first and last name. Now there are a dozen, 100 different naming cultures around the world, some of which have things that coherently map to first and last names, some of which have things which can be used if a system requires that and there is a reasonably fixed mapping, some of which don't really, and people kind of make things up in an ad hoc way. So, by making a very simple technical requirement, you're actually, putting an imposition on the world. And I would say that the rapid rise in online shopping systems designed by people who make those kinds of cultural assumptions and then roll those same systems out across wider variety of cultures will probably have a profound effect on social naming practices over the next 20 years, which is weird. So I think that it's a good example of exactly that.
Do you agree, Stäheli, or in your view, what's the relationship between technology and political discussion?
I think I would fully agree with you. I mean, it's impossible to think of technology as something which is not political at the same time and which is not also social at the same time. I think this is a highly problematic distinction if we want to separate a purely technical level of the discussion from social and political factors. I mean, there's, for example, a very nice book by Alex Galloway, who did a book on internet protocols and who was showing very well how the protocols embody certain political ideas of freedom, of how to connect to each other. And I think that's also a good example that what we sometimes tend to see as something just technical is inscribed within political meaning. And also probably linking up to that, what I found very interesting in your talk when you were speaking about weird machines, that there are also, I could also imagine that it is possible that there are political consequences which were not intended when the technology was produced, but the technical things, I mean, that is something we could learn, or we were able to learn from Bruno Latour's network theory. They act in a way we don't know how they will act, and these actions can be seen and are very often political as well.
Yeah. No one, when people started looking into low latency TCP/IP protocol flows, no one was intending to design high-speed financial trading flash crashes. Like, this was not an intended outcome of that protocol development practice. And yet, if you look at the uses of networking technologies within the financial market, there's this, like, fairly straightforward, like, oh, if you build a network that does such and such, eventually you're going to get to a point where machines can transact stocks so fast that we are going to be completely and utterly shocked and horrified at the serious real-world economic consequences. And I don't remember the numbers, so I will speak very roughly here, but there are a few very well-known flash crashes, but it turns out that if you actually look at the raw trading data, it's an almost daily occurrence that you will get some large corporation will lose 90% of its stock value and then come back up in a tenth of a second, and it's just like $5 billion of shareholder value that evaporate for a few microseconds. This is weird. This is not supposed to happen. I think what I kind of want to say here is that it's, and this is a point that I raised in the talk with Quinn Norton at Congress earlier this year, that it's impossible to make a technical act without also making a political act. Like 20 or 30 years ago, we used to be kind of off in a place where we thought we could perform acts that were only technical, and then the world sort of shifted, and now we can't.
these high-speed financial transactions, when you read about it or heard about it, was this a moment when you first thought about de-networking as a socialist, as a sociologist? Social theorist.
And actually, it was one of the moments before I wrote about de-networking, I also wrote on the history of financial speculation, and especially in the US, and also how the way we think about financial speculation, and not only we, but the practitioners themselves, changes. And one moment which is, I think, very telling in which models we choose to think financial speculation is that more and more epidemiological models are being used. So, I mean, we know it from everyday speech about contagion, that speculative behavior is contagious behavior. And that would be, I mean, in my language of connectivity, that would be hyperconnective behavior which runs out of control, even for those who are thinking or who are hoping to profit from what they are doing in financial speculation. And what in financial speculation and the financial economy I think becomes visible is that de-networking, of course, is a very general notion, but that it is not always a critical political perspective. What I emphasized in the last part of my talk were, if you like, some sort of tactics of being not linked so much, you could say, but this also has a control perspective, and that is important to the epidemiological models in finance economy, because now we have, we speak even about firewalls, we speak about immunization of banks, of bad banks, islands, which are not connected that much to other banks. And what is interesting in that case is that we see that de-networking can not only be a critical political tactics, but also a strategy of control, as in the financial economy.
I think that there is something interesting in the accumulative bias of most network dialogue that we do speak in terms of this positive thing where you talk about the presence of links. I think to a certain degree, though, that's actually a reasonably coherent response to and representative of the fundamental structure of networks, right? So every time you have every social organizing structure is a way of saying, well, there's 7 billion people in this room. I can't even deal with that number. How do I act, right? How do I take a single step in a room with 7 billion people in it? Well, okay, maybe first I start with, I'm related to this set of people, and we get a tribe, and like, okay, I can understand there's a small number of people in my tribe, and I can interact with those people, and then there's other tribes, and I can sort of interact with them as units, and we've immediately got this clustering, so we've got a simplification of the reactions that I need to have. And the same thing in institution, I have a certain number of hierarchical relationships, and I can scale to a certain degree because I have a limited number of those. In a network, we don't have those a priori filters, right? But we still have to deal with, oh my God, there's 7 billion people in this room. So we create a sparse set of links. And we have some set of links, and the more of those links that we can have, in some ways the more efficient the network is at whatever task it's trying to accomplish. Networks are task or activity directed. To a first approximation, the degree of connectivity of a network increases the efficiency by which any task the network is trying to achieve can be achieved. So that's why we talk about the increase of links, and it's always more links are good up until we run into an external limit. we don't talk about the links that aren't there because there's an unimaginable number of them, and if I have 7 billion factorial potential links in an overall network structure among humans, I really don't want to think about what that number is. That number is a deeply existentially terrifying number. Instead, I'm going to think about the 150 people I know, and that's a number that is human, that I can deal with. So yeah, I mean, there's a tension between that accumulative kind of almost capitalistic logic, especially when you're talking about like Twitter follower counts or whatever, versus the like true existential horror of what might be, and I don't know that thinking about the existential horror is necessarily the productive way to get away from the accumulative logic.
Is there any questions in the audience? Okay.
Hi. Thanks for the panel. I have a question for okay. I have a question for Stäheli actually, because I really enjoyed your talk, but I'm not just so sure about the examples you gave, because they were all like exceptional. They were all deliberative action, artistic, activist, and I'm not sure if it really works that way that easily to disconnect. And isn't it much more of a general everyday problem that, of course, as a sociologist, by profession, you should be interested in. My everyday situation, I want to watch a video, and in order to watch it, I need the update. So I agree to a lot of terms of trade, and I click yes. But I agree to a lot of things that I actually don't want to be connected with. So that's not that's not my choice to do that, but it happens to me in order to be up to date. So and the other my other example is like when people ask me hey, we should be friends on Facebook, and I'm sorry, I'm not on Facebook, and then like in 99% people won't say, oh, well, you're a social retard. They usually say, oh, great, yeah, don't join the club. That's actually much better. So there seems to be like this paradoxical desire to be connected, but at the same time, not on that kind of network, because it's somehow, everyone knows that it's kind of evil, but still we're there. So I don't know, there's like this general social need for community, which is great, and connection, which is great, but not in that kind of way. So I think the broader impact of my question is, is it really that easy to disconnect? Does it really need like some, click and then it's done? Is it much more like a complex cultural, social, I don't know.
Similar questions. The vision you illustrated with Lee Lozano, is that realistic? How does that work?
I mean, first of all, I think I would agree with most of what you said, that the point I was trying to make is that it is actually not easy to disconnect, and that we even do not have a language or vocabulary which really helps us to think about disconnection. And that was the reason why I was, as a sociologist, turning to art, because I had the intuition that actually, as a sociologist, we can learn from certain art practices because they explore more deeply than many sociological concepts do what disconnection could entail. And it also shows, especially that example which Lee Lozano, which I briefly mentioned, that example shows actually how extremely difficult it is to disconnect, how much practice, how much preparation it requires to disconnect. And I would also agree actually with what you said, that we should be careful now not to think about the single subject as somebody who is the sovereign subject who can decide him or herself whether he or she should be connected, because I mean that would reinstitute a kind of very powerful autonomous subject which we have got rid quite some time ago. So what is interesting is actually that there are these kind of imperatives, there are these kind of commands to connect, and what kind of tactics and what kind of strategies are being developed for responding to these demands. And I always liked a lot the work by de Certeau, who was speaking about the invention of everyday life and the practices of everyday life, and where he actually emphasizes that the tactics we use in everyday life, they are not subjective tactics, but rather they emerge in situations. And I think that is also crucial to the thinking of this connection, that we do not proceed from a subject which we assume, but rather that we look at situations and the arrangement of these situations and what kind of tactics become possible in these contexts.
When I listened to the both of you and your talks, I was wondering if you are talking about two different principles, because you talked about systems and their failures, for instance, or about bugs, and dealing with bugs or failures or interpreting failures in connection to the system seems to me something different from being disconnected. What do you think about the relationship between the two ways to deal with network systems?
I mean, I guess I was talking about a lot of different things. I think that failures are illustrative to us because they show us the logic of the system. I wasn't saying that I wasn't talking about disconnects as, disconnecting when a network has failed. That's a separate thing. I mean, yeah, I guess I'm not sure quite what you're...
You were not at all talking about disconnecting at all, whereas I think that's your topic.
I mean, I think partially that's because I think that the frame of disconnection is not a very useful frame. Like what you illustrated over there with that question, the choice isn't, oh, do I want to connect or not? It's, oh, do I want to submit to this logic of control, or can I engineer the system, possibly through its failures, that I get to redefine that logic in a way that works for me? And I think that it is much more productive right now to look at network structures from a perspective of where are the locuses of control and what are the outcomes of the functioning of the system than individual sub-choices about connection or disconnection.
A similar question in other words, is it possible at all to disconnect? Wouldn't that mean to be an asocial type? Something that doesn't exist, I think.
What is absolutely impossible is a full disconnection, and I think even if it were possible, it would be not desirable from my perspective. I think what I want to point at is more modest, that it is not, and I'm not arguing from the perspective of the single subject. Also, the single subject is confronted with all these imperatives of the networking society, but rather that I'm interested in how can we describe practices of severing links, of cutting links. And if we do not look at it just simply from the perspective of a subject which cuts himself or herself out of the network, we get actually a broader perspective. We get a perspective where the production of disconnections, the practices of disconnections, are not simply failures produced by a network, produced by a machine, but that they are tactics in the sense of the word. They answer to a problem in the situation and try to deal with these problems of the situation. So it is rather a perspective which looks at at practices establishing links between different nodes and how to cut again particular links, and what are the preconditions for doing this, but not the idea. I mean, that would be a very cultural critique and conservative idea, not the idea that we would then have a free subject which is freed from all the burdens of networks.
Society.
I wanted to try to raise a question that might bring up the natural rift between a sociologist and a toolmaker or a coder, and that would be, in my own, I have a tendency to kind of analyze this technological landscape as problematic in that it's emphasizing tools of efficiency and coming to goal-oriented tasks and things like that. And if I ask from a perspective if these tools or this technological landscape is improving something like the quality of life, or is it making it interesting for the way that organisms can connect with each other as opposed to sort of machine-like thinking, I just wanted to see if you could respond to, do you get a perspective sometimes that the language of the machines is detrimental to the interaction between humans as organisms?
I think that it is possibly not the sort of the native dialogue and the native way that things are talked about, although this has changed a lot with social networks. But I think that one can just as easily talk about socially satisfying performances of cultural scripts and technological affordances that improve the outcomes of, socially satisfying performances of cultural scripts, as you can talk about things that improve the efficiency of a purely technical transaction. So I don't think that I think it may not be the native register to where some tool builders end up. I think that's starting to change, though, as more and more technologists, more and more programmers, more and more hardware developers realize that, there is a place for wonder, there's a place for joy in everyday technical interactions, and also there is a much broader set of outcomes than, purely kind of neoliberalist efficiency structured outcomes that we can design for. There's an entire slow interface movement talking about ambient awareness, talking about serendipitous interfaces. There's even in the kind of what I would think of as the very aggressive technical end of the work I do around looking at and evaluating security tools for extremely high-risk users and extremely high-risk use cases. I think there's a growing recognition that actually how much fun an interface is to use, how enjoyable the set of cultural interactions and social interactions that are afforded by that interface have as much to do with those purely technical security outcomes as any set of proofs or anything else does. This is the cute cat theory of internet freedom, that kind of structure is actually more important than a lot of the purely technical proofs might be.
Just a small point to add. I think it's important to see that also when I speak about this connection, it is not a juxtaposition of the social or the organic human and the machine. Rather, I think sometimes you even need the help of machines to disconnect. If think, for example, of the Facebook suicide machine, which would be a software, but where you need machines, where you need non-human help in order to disconnect.
Still questions here? Something to add?
Ja, hallo. Wäre es möglich, dass ich was auf Deutsch sage und Sie übersetzen das dann? Weil ich traue mich das nicht auf Englisch zu sagen.
Ja, ich versuche das.
Also bis jetzt, ich fand es wahnsinnig interessant, was Sie beide gesagt haben. Ich lese aber dieses Beispiel von der Lee Lozano anders, also dieses Kunstwerk. Und zwar sehe ich das so, dass das total ironisch gemeint ist, dass man eben natürlich durch Nichtstun sofort von der Bildfläche verschwindet und es eigentlich nichts Einfacheres gibt, als zu verschwinden. Und dass eben man als Künstler total viel damit beschäftigt ist, als Alleinunternehmer, sich selbst zu promoten und deswegen ständig irgendwo hinrennen muss und irgendwie sich, also Werbung für sich selbst machen muss, sodass man halt dann vielleicht gar nicht mehr dazu kommt, Kunstwerke zu produzieren. Und darin sehe ich jetzt, also ich finde die Analogie auch sehr schön, also den Vergleich, hier geht es ja bei den Usern um das Leben, also die haben ja, die vermarkten ja das, also sie produzieren ihr Leben, also da geht es gar nicht um Kunstwerke, sondern um das Leben und jeder will leben und möglichst viel leben und ja, und wenn ich jetzt eben genau wie bei Lee Lozano, also das versuche zu verschwinden, ja, wie sage ich das, also ich arbeite mich ab in den sozialen Netzwerken im Netz eben und die Gefahr besteht doch, dass ich dadurch, dass ich ständig diese Netzwerke bediene, am Computer sitze und eben ja, also das, was man eigentlich unter Leben versteht, dass das verloren geht. Also so also verstehe ich das jetzt oder würde dieses Kunstwerk da auch interpretieren und finde das eigentlich wahnsinnig aktuell und danke Ihnen für diesen Hinweis.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think you're right. Of course, Lee Lozano could have just stopped producing any art and not written a manifesto, not made several instructions of how actually to deal with the art system, which is more and more based and focused on connections, on gallery events, parties, and similar elements. But what then would have been lost is that this piece of art, of leaving the art system, has exactly also a political moment making visible the predominance of connection within the art system. And what I'm interested in are especially cases of disconnection. I only mentioned it very briefly at the beginning of my talk, of disconnection within networks, and I think for that for that case, Lee Lozano is a good example because she's struggling somehow with the problem of how, at least for a certain time, how to be part of the art system and at the same time disconnected from the art system. And she's struggling with that kind of very deep conflict. And in that sense, I think this performance is also an ironic comment, but it is also kind of very deep reflections about when and how can disconnection become a political act as well.
I think it's, there's a really interesting thing encoded in there about, you saying that it was just, in some ways, just a cessation, just a stopping of doing these things. That's when we think about networked identities, and this is a slight tangent, but she was, in some ways, what she was trying to do was to terminate her identity as an artist, or the public performance of that identity. And that is exactly how network membership works. That if I have a machine on the internet and it stops performing the network function, if it stops parsing IP packets, what we call that machine is offline. We call it no longer part of the internet, and that is the act of disconnection, is exactly that act of just simple cessation.
We take this as a roundup for this panel. Thanks a lot. We continue in 15 minutes with the politics of sleep.